Florida after dark is a different animal entirely. Not the neon-lit, bass-thumping $20 cocktail version of After Dark that most people picture when they think about this state at night. Not South Beach at midnight. Not the Strip in Fort Lauderdale. Not the boardwalk bars in Clearwater with the cover charges and the mechanical bulls. I'm talking about the other kind of After Dark. The kind where the loudest sound on the main street is a screen door swinging shut somewhere down the block. Where the bait shop closes at 8, and the guy who runs it is already home on his porch with a beer before the sun finishes setting. Where the whole idea of nightlife is something that belongs to another Florida entirely, a Florida visible only on television and real estate commercials, bearing essentially no resemblance to what's actually happening in the town you're sitting in. There's a version of Florida that exists almost entirely off the map that most people carry around in their heads. A coastal Florida made up of towns that never built the condos, never widened the highway into a commercial strip, never figured out how to market themselves to the tourists who were busy being marketed to by everywhere else. Towns where the beach has no parking meter because nobody ever thought to install one, where the best seafood comes from a window cut into the side of a building with no name on it, run by a woman whose grandmother ran the same window with the same recipes 60 years before. Where after dark doesn't mean louder and brighter, it means quieter, stranger, more alive in ways that have nothing to do with entertainment, and everything to do with what happens when a place just lets itself be what it is, hour after hour, night after night, without trying to perform for anyone. I went looking for 12 of those places specifically, towns along Florida's beaches and coastlines where after dark feels genuinely different, where the night belongs to the people who live there rather than the people passing through. What I found ranged from a fishing town on the Gulf that hasn't added a new street in 50 years to a panhandle community where the entire downtown clears out by 9 and the only sound after that is the tide and whatever's moving through the palmettos behind the houses. Before we get into all 12, go ahead and subscribe right now because we cover these overlooked, underrated, and outright forgotten corners of Florida every single week. And some of these places we're about to get into are so unusual and so genuinely unknown that I want to make sure you don't miss what comes after this list. Let's get into it. Horseshoe Beach sits in Dixie County on Florida's Big Bend coast, and it holds the unusual distinction of being one of the few incorporated towns anywhere on the Gulf side of the state that has deliberately refused, year after year, decade after decade, to grow in any direction whatsoever. The town's population hovers somewhere around the 200 mark, depending on the year and who's counting, making it one of the smallest incorporated towns anywhere near the Gulf Coast, and downtown, such as it is, consists of a boat ramp, a small marina, a handful of local businesses, and rows of modest waterfront homes that face out over some of the clearest, most pristine shallow water Gulf habitat anywhere in the state. What makes Horseshoe Beach fascinating specifically at night, and specifically in the context of what after dark means in a town like this, is the almost total absence of commercial lighting. There is no strip, there is no parking lot with those huge sodium vapor lights that turn everything orange and make it impossible to see the sky. When the sun goes down in Horseshoe Beach, the darkness that comes in behind it is genuine, old-fashioned, rural darkness, the kind that makes the stars overhead look like something from a photograph rather than something from real life. The Milky Way is visible here, on clear nights, with a clarity that genuinely startles people who've spent their whole lives in more developed parts of the state. The surrounding waters are part of the Big Bend Seagrasses Aquatic Preserve, a vast protected system of shallow seagrass meadows that supports one of the healthiest populations of sea scallops anywhere in Florida, drawing summer visitors for the annual scalloping season and then emptying back out again once that season closes, leaving Horseshoe Beach to return to its natural state, which is essentially nobody and nothing moving after dark, except the wildlife and the tide. Bioluminescent organisms in these waters are sometimes visible on summer nights from a kayak or a shallow draft boat, flickering blue-green sparks in the wake of a paddle stroke, the kind of thing that doesn't require a ticket or a tour guide, and that most people outside this small community have never seen or even heard of happening here. Home prices in Horseshoe Beach run low even by Dixie County standards, which are already among the most affordable coastal numbers anywhere in Florida, typically landing in the $150,000 to $230,000 range for a genuine Gulf front or Gulf view property, a figure that would be multiplied by 5 or 6 in any developed coastal town further south. The cost of living reflects the county's rural, minimally commercial character, and property taxes stay correspondingly modest. Healthcare requires a drive, with the nearest hospital facilities in Cross City and more comprehensive care in Gainesville, roughly an hour inland. But for a retiree whose definition of a good night out is sitting on a dark porch watching the bioluminescence flicker in the shallows and listening to nothing in particular, Horseshoe Beach offers a quality of life that essentially cannot be purchased anywhere near a more recognizable Florida beach town at any price. A retired marine biologist I spoke with near the boat ramp told me she'd studied coastal ecosystems across the entire Gulf of Mexico throughout her career, and the seagrass beds surrounding Horseshoe Beach remained, in her professional opinion, among the least impacted and most ecologically intact shallow water habitats anywhere in the northern Gulf. She said she moved here specifically because she wanted to retire somewhere she could continue watching those ecosystems without having to drive to a research station to do it. She walks to the water from her front door, she said, and the walk takes about 45 seconds. Panacea sits in Wakulla County on Florida's forgotten lower Panhandle coast, in a region that feels geographically like the Panhandle, but ecologically like something in between the Panhandle and the Big Bend, and that in-between quality gives it a character unlike anywhere else on either stretch of coast. The town is small, genuinely small, a few hundred full-time residents clustered along Okeechobee Bay and the network of tidal creeks that thread through the surrounding marshland. And the commercial district along Highway 98 consists of a handful of seafood houses, a bait shop or two, and not much else. What Panacea is genuinely famous for, at least among the people who know about it, is stone crabs. This stretch of Wakulla County coastline produces some of the finest stone crabs anywhere in Florida, and the small fleet of crabbing boats working out of Panacea's modest harbor supplies a disproportionately large percentage of the stone crabs sold in restaurants throughout the entire state. At night, when those boats come in, the working waterfront here looks and sounds and smells exactly the way a working waterfront should. Diesel exhaust and salt water, and the heavy wooden creak of traps being stacked, none of it polished or photographed or marketed to anyone. The Gulf Specimen Marine Laboratory in Panacea is one of the oldest public marine science facilities in the entire state, operating since the 1960s, and still run as a genuine working lab that supplies marine organisms to researchers and educational institutions throughout the country. It's open to the public during limited hours and represents one of the most genuinely interesting and unusual attractions anywhere on this stretch of coast. Though interesting here means watching live horseshoe crabs in a touch tank rather than anything involving a gift shop or a roller coaster. After dark in Panacea, the bay takes over completely. The commercial activity winds down early, the highway gets quiet, and the sounds that fill the space left behind are entirely natural: frogs from the surrounding marshes, wading birds calling from the tidal flats, the occasional splash of something large and unidentified moving through the black water of the bay. Kayakers who know this stretch of coast sometimes paddle these marshes at night in summer, specifically for the bioluminescence, which can be spectacular, here in the right conditions, the bow wake of a kayak trailing blue-green fire through the dark water between the cordgrass. Home prices in Panacea are genuinely affordable by any Florida coastal standard, typically in the $170,000 to $260,000 range, sometimes lower for older homes further from the immediate waterfront. Wakulla County keeps property taxes reasonable, and the cost of living sits comfortably below the national average. Healthcare access runs through Tallahassee, about 30 minutes north, giving Panacea residents surprisingly good access to the full Tallahassee hospital network without paying anything like Tallahassee prices to live here. A retired commercial crabber I spoke with near the docks told me his family had worked these waters for 3 generations, and he said the thing that had always drawn people to Panacea wasn't anything anyone built there, but rather the specific quality of quiet the place had after dark. A quiet you could almost touch, heavy with salt air and the sounds of the marsh doing whatever the marsh does when nobody's performing for anyone. Keaton Beach sits just south of Steinhatchee in Taylor County, on a stretch of Big Bend coast so undeveloped and so genuinely remote that reaching it requires navigating rural roads through pine forest for the better part of an hour, regardless of which direction you're coming from. The town, if you can call it a town in any conventional sense, consists primarily of a small community of fishing camps and vacation cottages clustered around a modest marina, a bait and tackle operation, and a handful of homes whose owners have been coming here, some of them, for 30 or 40 years, without anyone ever suggesting the place needed a restaurant with a wine list or a boutique hotel with a rooftop pool. The beach at Keaton is not a swimming beach in the traditional Florida sense. The Big Bend coast here is shallow, seagrassy, and edged with marsh rather than the sugar-white sand of the Panhandle, which means it has never attracted the kind of casual beach tourism that drives development elsewhere, and that has left it in a state of almost perfect undisturbed wildness. What it is, spectacularly, is a scalloping destination, with some of the most productive scallop beds anywhere in Florida, sitting in the crystal-clear shallow water just offshore, accessible by a short boat ride from the marina, and essentially uncrowded even at the height of scallop season, compared to more publicized Big Bend scalloping spots like Steinhatchee. After dark in Keaton Beach is something that visitors from more developed parts of the state often describe with a kind of stunned disbelief. There are no streetlights to speak of. The marina closes early. The only sounds after 9 or 10 o'clock are the wind coming off the Gulf, whatever's moving in the marsh grass, and the occasional low rumble of a boat motor somewhere out on the water, someone running late, someone who didn't want to come in when everyone else did. The darkness here is the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing, the kind that makes you realize you've been living under artificial light for so long you'd forgotten what actual night looks like. Bioluminescence in the shallow waters around Keaton Beach can be extraordinary in summer, and the combination of dark skies and productive water means that a night spent wading or paddling in these shallows is genuinely unlike almost anything available along Florida's more developed coasts. Home prices reflect the extreme remoteness, typically landing in the $130,000 to $210,000 range, sometimes considerably lower, and Taylor County's tax burden is among the most modest anywhere in the state. Healthcare is the significant trade-off, with the nearest hospital facilities requiring a substantial drive, but for a retiree whose priorities are centered on solitude, dark skies, extraordinary shallow water fishing and scalloping, and a coastal community that has genuinely never been discovered by any version of mainstream Florida tourism, Keaton Beach offers something rare enough that it almost defies description. East Point sits across the bridge from Apalachicola on Florida's Forgotten Coast, separated from its more famous neighbor by the 3-mile span of the John Gorey Memorial Bridge over Apalachicola Bay, and it occupies a strange and interesting position as the working-class counterpart to Apalachicola's increasingly gentrified historic downtown, where Apalachicola has boutique hotels and wine bars and galleries selling local art at prices that reflect the town's growing reputation as a weekend destination for Tallahassee and Atlanta money. East Point has oyster houses, fish camps, mobile homes on stilts, and a working waterfront that looks and operates essentially the way it has for the better part of a century. Franklin County, which contains both East Point and Apalachicola, produces more oysters by volume than almost any other county in the entire state, and the oyster industry that has sustained the region for generations is centered far more in East Point than in its more photogenic neighbor across the bridge. The oystermen who work Apalachicola Bay largely live in East Point, and the culture of the community reflects that working waterfront heritage in ways that feel increasingly rare on Florida's Gulf Coast, a place where the people who harvest the water actually live beside the water they harvest. After Dark in East Point has an energy that's hard to find on Florida's coast anywhere outside this small corner of Franklin County. The oyster houses and fish camps shut down early, and what replaces that activity is a kind of working community quiet. Families on porches, dogs wandering, the sound of the bay coming in over the marsh grass, the lights of Apalachicola visible across the water as a soft glow against the dark sky. There's a specific pleasure in being able to see the tourism economy of a nearby town from a distance, glowing and humming, while sitting in a place that has so far largely escaped it. Home prices in East Point run significantly lower than in Apalachicola, typically in the $220,000 to $320,000 range for waterfront or waterview properties, compared to the considerably more expensive Apalachicola market, driven by historic district demand and second home buyers. The cost of living across Franklin County stays below the national average, and property taxes remain reasonable. Healthcare runs through Weems Memorial Hospital in Apalachicola, just across the bridge, a small community hospital that handles routine and moderate care, with more comprehensive facilities in Panama City or Tallahassee for serious situations. A retired oyster processor I spoke with outside one of the Bayside fish houses told me she'd worked in the oyster industry her entire adult life, watched the bay go through bad years and good years, and years when disease wiped out half the beds overnight. And she said, East Point had always come back because the people who lived there were the kind of people who didn't have anywhere else they particularly wanted to be, the kind of people who were attached to a specific stretch of water rather than a general idea of what coastal living was supposed to look like. Carabel sits in Franklin County just east of Apalachicola, straddling the Carabel River where it meets the Gulf of Mexico, and it holds a genuinely improbable claim to fame that has become one of the more beloved pieces of Florida trivia for anyone who knows about it. Carabel is home to what has been widely certified as the world's smallest police station, a functioning phone booth on a downtown street corner that served as the actual operational base for the town's police department for years because the phone booth happened to be the most practical central location available. The booth is still there, preserved now as a kind of monument to a certain kind of small-town pragmatism that doesn't apologize for what it is. The town itself spreads along the river and the Carabel waterfront in a way that feels genuinely organic, unplanned in the best sense, with fishing boats moored alongside pleasure craft alongside the occasional shrimp trawler, the whole waterfront functioning as a working harbor rather than a curated destination. The surrounding waters of Apalachicola Bay and the Gulf are rich, productive, and remarkably uncrowded compared to the more heavily trafficked fishing grounds further east, and the fishing culture here runs deep, in a way that shapes the entire character of the community. After dark in Carabel, the river becomes the town's primary sensory experience. The tidal current running out through the river mouth on an outgoing tide makes an audible sound against the pilings of the older docks, a low rushing sound that carries inland several blocks on quiet nights. The waterfront bars, and there are a few in Carabel, operate on a schedule that reflects the fishing community's rhythms rather than any tourist calendar, which means they're sometimes crowded at unusual hours and sometimes essentially empty when you might expect them to be full, because the people drinking there are on the water's schedule rather than the clocks. Home prices in Carabel are among the more affordable genuine waterfront numbers anywhere in Florida, typically in the $200,000 to $310,000 range for river or bay access, reflecting Franklin County's overall affordability relative to more developed coastal counties. The cost of living stays below the national average, and the property tax burden remains reasonable. Healthcare access matches East Point, with Weems Memorial Hospital in Apalachicola serving the immediate area and more comprehensive care available in Panama City. A retired shrimp boat captain I met near the river mouth told me he'd retired 3 times from shrimping and gone back to it twice because he couldn't figure out what to do with himself when he wasn't on the water, and Carabel was the only place he'd ever lived where being a retired fisherman who couldn't stay retired was considered a completely normal way to exist. St. Mark's sits at the confluence of the St. Mark's River and the Wakulla River, where they merge and flow into Apalachee Bay on Florida's lower Gulf Coast, and it's one of the oldest continuously occupied European settlements in the entire state of Florida, a fact that almost nobody outside this corner of Wakulla County seems to know or particularly care about. The Spanish established a fort here in the early 1600s, and the strategic importance of the river junction kept St. Mark's militarily and commercially significant for centuries, through Spanish, British, and American periods of control, right up through the Civil War. What's left today is a tiny community, a few hundred residents, clustered around the river junction with a handful of seafood restaurants, a marina, and the San Marcos de Apalache Historic State Park, which preserves the ruins of the original fort, along with a small museum that tells the town's extraordinarily long and layered history in a way that feels genuinely revelatory if you've never encountered it before. The town is connected to Tallahassee by the Tallahassee-St. Mark's Historic Railroad Trail, a paved recreational trail following the route of one of Florida's earliest railroads, and Tallahassee cyclists make the round trip regularly, though they mostly clear out well before dark. After dark in St. Mark's, the river is everything. The tidal St. Mark's River, black and deep and impossibly smooth on calm nights, reflects the stars with a clarity that makes it look like the sky continues below the surface, and the sounds that travel across that water at night. Great horned owls from the surrounding forest, the occasional splash of a large fish, the low calls of wading birds settling into the marsh grass, are the sounds of a genuinely wild river system right at the edge of a community that has managed to exist beside wildness without trying to contain or monetize it. The St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge surrounds the community on multiple sides, protecting hundreds of thousands of acres of coastal marsh, pine flatwoods, and tidal river habitat, and the wildlife that lives in that refuge uses the town itself as freely as any other part of its range. White-tailed deer browsing the edges of yards after dark are a nightly occurrence. The alligator population in the river and its surrounding marshes is substantial, visible from the town's docks on warm nights, eyes reflecting whatever light reaches the water from the nearest house. Home prices in St. Mark's are strikingly affordable, given the genuine historic depth and the extraordinary natural surroundings, typically in the $180,000 to $280,000 range, with the cost of living tracking well below the national average across Wakulla County. Healthcare access runs through Tallahassee, about 20 miles north, giving St. Mark's residents the full Tallahassee hospital network within a genuinely short drive. A retired history teacher I met near the fort ruins told me she'd taught Florida history for 30 years, in a school where most of her students assumed Florida's history started roughly around the time Walt Disney got involved, and she'd moved to St. Mark's specifically to retire somewhere that could prove them wrong without saying a word, a place where the history was just sitting there in the ground, visible and real and older than almost anything else in the state. If you're finding these towns genuinely interesting, go ahead and hit that like button, because we still have several more to get through, and the ones coming up include a Gulf Island community that has no bridge, a fishing village where the power grid itself is optional, and a stretch of coast where the nighttime sky is so dark that the local community has actually incorporated dark sky preservation into their planning guidelines. Tap that like button and let's keep going. Apalachicola itself is worth examining in the context of what After Dark means, specifically because the town exists in a state of interesting transition that plays out most visibly at night. During the day, Apalachicola's historic downtown looks increasingly like a destination. Boutique hotels in restored Victorian buildings, galleries and wine bars filling up the street-level spaces of 19th-century commercial blocks, weekend visitors from Tallahassee and Atlanta carrying coffees and wearing linen. But after dark, specifically late at night, a different Apalachicola reasserts itself. The day trippers leave. The weekend visitors go back to their hotel rooms. The wine bars close. And what's left at midnight in Apalachicola is something older and stranger and more genuinely itself. The working waterfront with its particular sounds and smells, the empty streets of the historic district lit by actual gas lanterns whose light is warm and low and throws deep shadows, the sound of the bay wind coming up through the river mouth and moving through the Spanish moss and the old live oak trees that line downtown. This is a town that has been here, continuously, since the 1820s, and at certain hours of the night it feels like that age, in a way that the daytime version of Apalachicola almost manages to obscure. The oyster industry that built Apalachicola and sustained it for generations is under genuine strain, recovering unevenly from years of drought and freshwater diversion issues upriver that have affected the bay's salinity and oyster productivity, and that strain shows in the town's economic character in ways that push back against the gentrification narrative. Alongside the boutique hotels, there are buildings that have been empty for years, storefronts whose owners have aged out of the business and whose children have moved to Tallahassee or Atlanta, leaving gaps in the commercial fabric that have so far resisted filling. Home prices in Apalachicola have risen considerably over the past decade, but remain lower than in comparable historic coastal towns elsewhere in Florida, typically in the $280,000 to $450,000 range for historic district properties and somewhat lower for residential neighborhoods outside the immediate downtown core. The cost of living reflects a town in transition, no longer purely a working fishing community, but not yet fully a resort destination either, sitting in an interesting and currently affordable middle ground. Healthcare comes through Weems Memorial, right in town for routine care, and Panama City or Tallahassee for more serious situations. A retired architect I spoke with on a late-night walk through the historic district told me he'd moved to Apalachicola, specifically because the town reminded him of Florida as it existed in old photographs, before air conditioning reorganized the entire relationship between buildings and climate, before the interstate reorganized the entire relationship between towns and geography. He said walking these streets at night, with the gas lanterns and the live oaks and the bay wind, was the closest he'd ever come to experiencing a Florida that no longer existed anywhere else he'd been. Lanark Village sits just east of Carabel in Franklin County. and its history is one of the more genuinely unusual origin stories of any small coastal community in the state. The village was originally built in the 1940s as a military training camp during World War II, a facility where tens of thousands of soldiers trained before deployment, and the orderly, grid-like layout of the community reflects that military origin in a way that still feels slightly out of place in the surrounding landscape of coastal marsh and slash pine. After the war, the military installation was converted into a resort community, and then gradually into a permanent residential community. And today, Lanark Village is home to a small population of retirees and permanent residents who live in modest homes on streets that still follow the original military camp layout, in a setting of extraordinary natural beauty right on the Gulf of Mexico, with almost no commercial development of any kind to speak of. The beach here is quiet, in a way that even other Franklin County beaches rarely achieve. There are no concessions, no beach chairs for rent, no volleyball nets, no lifeguard stands, no signs telling you what you can't do. Just the beach itself, wide and relatively empty, with the Gulf on one side and the pine forest on the other, and at night that simplicity becomes something close to overwhelming. The absence of commercial lighting means that the stars are visible on clear nights with something approaching their full complement, and the Gulf at night here makes a sound and creates a smell and reflects the moonlight in ways that feel prehistoric in the best possible sense. Home prices in Lanark Village run remarkably low for genuine Gulf-adjacent property, typically in the $180,000 to $280,000 range, reflecting the community's modest size and Franklin County's overall affordability. The cost of living stays well below the national average, and the community's quiet, residential character keeps day-to-day expenses minimal. Healthcare runs through the same Franklin County and regional network that serves Carabel and Apalachicola, with more comprehensive care available in Panama City or Tallahassee. A retired naval officer I spoke with near the beach told me he'd recognized the military camp layout of the streets the first time he visited Lanark, the kind of grid that only gets built when someone needs to house a very large number of people in a very organized hurry, and he said that origin story had been part of what made him want to live there. He liked the idea of a place built for a wartime purpose that had transformed itself, quietly and completely, into somewhere entirely devoted to the opposite of urgency. Deckley Beach sits between Keaton Beach and Steinhatchee on Taylor County's Gulf Coast, in a stretch of the Big Bend so remote that naming it as a destination requires a kind of confidence that most GPS systems don't quite share. The community is small enough that calling it a community feels generous. A scattered collection of fishing camps and waterfront homes along a narrow road that ends at the Gulf, with no commercial development, no amenities to speak of, and no particular reason for anyone to come unless they already know exactly what they're looking for. What they're looking for, the people who find their way to Deckley Beach, is the specific quality of the Big Bend coast, the shallow, seagrassy, remarkably productive water that makes this stretch of Gulf some of the finest inshore fishing and scalloping in the entire state, combined with the absolute and total absence of anything resembling development or infrastructure. The nearest fuel is a significant drive. The nearest grocery store is further than most people from more developed parts of Florida would consider acceptable. The beach itself is not a recreational beach in any conventional sense, but a working edge between land and water that belongs entirely to whatever's living in and around it. After dark at Deckley Beach, the Gulf is so close and so quiet, and so entirely without competition from any commercial noise or lighting, that the experience of sitting beside it approaches something genuinely meditative. The water here is often bioluminescent in summer, and the shallow tidal flats that stretch far offshore glow and flicker with planktonic life, disturbed by any movement through the water, including the movement of the night herons and reddish egrets and roseate spoonbills that work these flats after dark in numbers that seem impossible given how few people know this coastline exists. Property here changes hands rarely and often informally, but when it does, prices reflect the extreme remoteness, often in the $120,000 to $190,000 range for modest waterfront or near waterfront camps, though the market is thin enough and informal enough that generalizing is difficult. Taylor County's tax burden is among the lowest in the state. Healthcare requires a substantial drive to Perry or beyond, and that is the honest, significant trade-off for living this far from any medical infrastructure. But for a retiree whose idea of what Florida should feel like is rooted in something older and wilder and less managed than what most of the state has become, Declo Beach offers an encounter with that older Florida that is becoming genuinely difficult to find anywhere else. A retired fishing guide I met near the boat ramp at Declo told me he'd spent his entire working life on these waters and had watched the bass fishermen and the trout fishermen and the redfish fishermen come and go across 4 decades, and the one thing that had never changed, the one thing that kept all of them coming back, was the specific quality of light on the water here at dusk, the way the last of the afternoon sun caught the surface of the Gulf and turned it a color he'd never been able to describe to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves, somewhere between gold and copper, and a third color that he said simply didn't have a name in English. Suwannee, the town, rather than the river, sits at the mouth of that famous river, where it finally empties into the Gulf of Mexico after a 250-mile journey from its headwaters in southern Georgia, and it represents one of the more genuinely end-of-the-road places on this entire list. The town is small, a few hundred permanent residents at most, clustered around the marina and the waterfront properties that line the last few miles of the river before it opens into the Gulf. And the character of the community reflects the river's character almost perfectly: wide, slow, dark, and moving in a direction that feels entirely its own. The Suwannee River is one of the most celebrated rivers in American music, and one of the least known American rivers in terms of what it actually looks like and what actually lives in it. The water is tea-dark, stained by tannins from the cypress and pine forests upriver, and it runs over a limestone riverbed through a landscape of extraordinary natural richness, home to freshwater springs, manatees, river otters, alligators in substantial numbers, and a fish population that has drawn anglers to this specific stretch of coast for generations. At night, the river mouth at Suwannee produces one of the more dramatic wildlife spectacles available anywhere on Florida's Gulf Coast. Not dramatic in the theatrical sense, but in the purely biological sense. The movement of large numbers of fish and marine mammals through the confluence of fresh and salt water, visible as surface disturbances and occasional aerial activity, even in low light. Manatees seeking the warmth of the spring-fed river in cooler months are audible if not always visible after dark, their characteristic sneezing exhale carrying across the water from a distance. Home prices in Suwannee reflect the town's remoteness and limited infrastructure, typically in the $200,000 to $330,000 range for waterfront or riverview properties, reflecting the genuine draw of the river access combined with the town's end-of-road character. Dixie County's overall affordability keeps carrying costs down, and the cost of living across the county stays well below the national average. Healthcare requires a meaningful drive to Chiefland or Gainesville, and that's the same honest trade-off that applies across most of this stretch of Florida's nature coast. A retired river guide I spoke with near the marina told me he'd floated every navigable stretch of the Suwannee River at least a dozen times over his career, sometimes for work and sometimes just because he wanted to, and he said the last section of river before it reached the Gulf was unlike anything upstream, a place where the river seemed to slow down and widen and take its time finishing something it had been doing for a very long distance, and he said the town of Suwannee had that same quality, a place that seemed to have arrived somewhere specific and decided there was no particular reason to keep moving. Cedar Key sits on a small island connected to the mainland by a causeway in Levy County, and it occupies a position on the edge of the Florida that most people know that is genuinely unique among all the small Gulf Coast communities in this part of the state. The town is technically known, included in lists of charming Florida getaways, visited by enough people on enough weekends that its restaurants occasionally require a wait, and its handful of small hotels sometimes book up ahead of time. But Cedar Key after dark, specifically late after dark, after the day trippers have driven back across the causeway and the weekend visitors have gone to bed, is a completely different proposition. The town sits on 3 small islands, the inhabited one known as Waikiki, connected to each other and to the mainland by a network of low bridges and causeways, and the surrounding waters of the Lower Suwannee National Wildlife Refuge protect one of the most extraordinary coastal ecosystems on the entire Gulf side of the state. Thousands of acres of seagrass, oyster bar, tidal marsh, and open Gulf water, largely inaccessible to anything larger than a kayak or a small shallow draft boat. At night, the refuge is alive in ways that the daytime doesn't fully reveal. Shorebirds and wading birds moving through the tidal flats, dolphins working the edges of the seagrass beds, the occasional brief and startling surfacing of a manatee in the channel between the islands. The town itself has a history that most casual visitors don't know, and that locals are often quietly proud of. A history as a major industrial and commercial port in the mid-1800s that ended abruptly and almost completely when a hurricane in 1896 destroyed most of the town and the railroad that connected it to the mainland, clearing the slate in a way that allowed the place to rebuild slowly and on its own terms, never quite regaining its former commercial importance, but retaining a character that feels authentically itself in a way that many better-known Florida beach towns have entirely lost. After dark in Cedar Key, after the evening crowd at the waterfront restaurants disperses and the gift shops close, and the kayak outfitters put away their equipment, the island reverts to something close to its essential nature. The smell of low tide and salt water, and the specific funk of oyster bars exposed by the tide, is stronger at night than during the day. The sound of the Gulf moving through the channels between the islands is cleaner and more present without the daytime boat traffic. The sky over the refuge, which has no development on it in any direction for several miles, is dark enough that the stars make the water below them look like a second sky. And on clear nights with a light sea breeze, sitting on the waterfront in Cedar Key after midnight is one of the more genuinely affecting natural experiences available anywhere in Florida. Home prices in Cedar Key run higher than in the more remote Big Bend communities on this list, reflecting the town's modest but real reputation as a destination, typically in the $300,000 to $500,000 range for waterfront or waterview properties, and somewhat lower for residential properties inland on the island. The cost of living is correspondingly somewhat higher than in the truly remote communities further down the coast, though it remains well below anything comparable in more developed coastal Florida. Healthcare runs through Gainesville, about an hour away, giving Cedar Key residents access to the full UF Health network. The trade-off of that drive is a town that manages to be simultaneously known and unknown, reachable and remote, a place that exists at the edge of the Florida that most people know without quite being part of it. A retired painter I spoke with on the waterfront told me she'd moved to Cedar Key 20 years ago after a career spent painting coastal subjects across the Gulf Coast from Texas to the Keys, and she said the light in Cedar Key was different from anywhere else she'd worked. Something to do with the interaction of the open Gulf light with the shallow seagrass-tinted water and the particular angle of the sun across the marsh, a quality of light she'd been trying to paint accurately ever since she arrived, and that she was still not quite convinced she'd gotten right, despite the fact that she'd tried several hundred times. Steinhatchee sits at the mouth of the Steinhatchee River in Taylor County, straddling the line between Dixie and Taylor counties in a way that gives it a slightly schizophrenic administrative character, and it's one of the more interesting cases on this list because it occupies a middle ground between genuinely undiscovered and modestly known that gives it a character unlike the most remote Big Bend communities, while still feeling entirely unlike anywhere that's fully developed. The town is known among serious anglers, known enough that the scallop season in summer brings a surge of visitors that fills the town's modest collection of waterfront fish camps and small motels, but unknown enough that outside of that scalloping season, Steinhatchee returns to a baseline of genuine quiet that the rest of Florida largely can't achieve anymore. The river itself is the town's organizing principle, a dark tannin-stained stream that flows through a landscape of cypress and hardwood swamp before opening into the Gulf through an estuary of extraordinary productivity. Trout and redfish in the grass flats, sheep's head around the oyster bars, flounder in the deeper holes, tarpon moving through the river mouth in season. The fishing here is varied and serious in a way that attracts serious fishermen and essentially no one else, which keeps the character of the town firmly oriented toward the water and the people who know how to use it, rather than toward any kind of tourist economy. After dark in Steinhatchee, the river speaks. The outgoing tide pushes that dark water past the docks and the fish camps, with a sound that's audible from anywhere close to the bank, a low, continuous rush of moving water that sets the rhythm of the night. Night fishing from the docks is common here, not performatively or for social media purposes, but practically, because certain fish bite better in the dark, and the people who live here know it and take advantage of it. The smell of the river at low tide, a mix of marsh grass and tidal mud, and the specific organic richness of productive subtropical estuary is powerful and strange, and to people who love it, irreplaceable. Home prices in Steinhatchee range more widely than in some of the more remote communities, reflecting the modest but real seasonal demand, typically in the $200,000 to $360,000 range for waterfront fish camp or river access properties, with cheaper options available for homes further from the water. Taylor County's tax burden stays modest, and the cost of living overall sits below the national average. Healthcare access requires a drive to Perry, about 35 minutes inland, or the larger Gainesville network for more serious care. A retired fishing guide I met near the river told me he'd guided clients on the Steinhatchee River for 30 years and had watched the scallop season get bigger and noisier every year, the boats more numerous, the crowds at the river mouth more chaotic, and he said the thing that kept him sane was knowing that every September 1st, when the season closed, the river went back to being exactly what it was. The crowds vanished, the fish camps emptied out, and the town settled back into the rhythm that was its actual rhythm, not the seasonal performance, the real daily life of a working river community that knew.